We find it delightfully unlivable here in this ghostly retreat. Several prominent spirits have retired here from creepy old crypts all over the world. However, not everyone makes the cut. There have been a few poltergeists who have applied, but were not granted residency. For example,
Remember the 5th of November. Gunpowder treason and plot. We see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot.
Guy Fawkes was one of the conspirators responsible for the gunpowder plot of 1605, a failed assassination of King James I. Consequently, Fawkes was found guilty of high treason. After some extensive torture, he was hanged and quartered on January 31st, 1606. If there is a lesson to be learned, it's that you don't mess with the king. And speaking of kings, King Henry VIII was once considered for residency at the Haunted Mansion.
King Henry VIII, to 6 wives he was wedded. 1 died, 1 survived, 2 divorced, and 2 beheaded.
In a portrait that would have been hung in the Haunted Mansion, Henry would have appeared alongside his second wife, Anne Boleyn. For those of you familiar with the pair, you'll probably remember that Henry had his wife beheaded when she couldn't produce a male heir. Judging by their portrait, I'd say she had a thing or two to say about the matter. There is at least one Brit dwelling amongst our unholy halls. To some people he's known as the Leather Apron. Others called him the Whitechapel Murderer. But around here, we call him Jack the Ripper.
London, a city torn apart by fear and hate, as the mob howled for the blood of the human monster Scotland Yard could never catch.
Every lunatic and sensation seeker in London has given himself up as Jack the Ripper.
Stop using that stupid name!
During the late 1800s, a series of murders took place in the Whitechapel district of London. It's believed that somewhere between 5 to 11 women were brutally murdered by the Ripper, starting with his first canonical victim, Mary Ann Nichols, who died in August of 1888. These murders caught the attention of worldwide press outlets, but were particularly potent in London for obvious reasons. People were stunned by the savagery of the Whitechapel murders. Public outcry pressured police to engage in house-to-house inquiry targeting physicians, surgeons, and even butchers based on the severity of the murders. Despite their best efforts, the authorities were never able to unravel the identity of the Whitechapel murderer. But here were a few theories we found intriguing. Also known as the Borough Prisoner, Chapman was a known serial killer responsible for the deaths of 3 of his mistresses. For a time, he served as an apprentice to a senior surgeon before taking a course on practical surgery. He emigrated to London in 1888, the same year as the first murder attributed to Jack the Ripper. While living in London, Chapman opened a barber shop. He poisoned his first paramour in 1897. The toxin he used was known for causing particularly painful deaths and would go on to become Chapman's contaminant of choice. Soon after, he met a local girl named Bessie, followed by a courtship that lasted until her death in 1901. Any guesses how she met her end? Well done! she was poisoned. After the death of a third woman, 1 year later in 1902, law enforcement started to grow suspicious. They discovered the third woman, Maud Marsh, had indeed been poisoned. Some detectives in Scotland Yard started to suspect that Chapman may also be Jack the Ripper. He was described as a violent man and even lived in London at the same time as the Whitechapel murders. His former occupations meant he'd be proficient with either a scalpel or a razor, and even matched the description of a gentleman seen with the final murder victim, Mary Jane Kelly. While there wasn't enough evidence to connect him to the Whitechapel murders, he was tried and hanged for poisoning Maud Marsh in 1903. He was a fish porter and a former lover of Mary Jane Kelly. Some people at the time described him as a scorned and jealous individual who murdered the other women in order to discourage Kelly from working the streets as a lady of the night. This one is particularly interesting and peculiar. The author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass has been considered by some as a suspect in the Whitechapel murders. In a theory put forth by author Richard Wallace, Carroll may have experienced a psychotic break due to an assault he suffered as a child. While exploring the work of Lewis Carroll and by dissecting wordplay and anagrams, Wallace believed he discovered some insight to the author's state of mind, and perhaps an admission to the Whitechapel murders. In addition, there is an odd coincidence where Lewis Carroll used purple ink on his daily journal entries, but on the dates of each of the famous murders, he instead used black. Also known as Jill the Ripper, Mary Piercy was the only female suspect of the Whitechapel murders. In the fall of 1890, Piercy murdered a young woman known as Phoebe Hogg. In fact, when Hogg's body was discovered, her head was nearly severed from her body. The great Sir Arthur Conan Doyle once speculated that Jack the Ripper might have been female. However, outside of the fact that Piercy lived near the locations of the Whitechapel murders, most evidence presented to support this particular theory is purely circumstantial. At the end of the 19th century, some periodicals started to report their suspicions that Jack the Ripper would have likely been a medical man of high standing. This particular theory led several people to consider Queen Victoria's physician William Gull. Historians have since dismissed this proposal, but it would continue to prevail throughout literature and the cinema. Some stories claim that the Whitechapel murders transpired as a way to cover up the secret marriage of Prince Albert. If this theory were true, William Gull would have used his surgical skills to eviscerate anyone aware of Albert's marriage and the subsequent child. These are just a few of the theories regarding the true identity of one of the mansion's deadliest residents. But what do you think? Which one of these theories is your favorite? Tell us all about it in the comments section below. And why not take a moment to watch one of these other films highlighting the residents of the Haunted Mansion?